I've spent the better part of 30 years building a legacy from nothing, thinking that if I just worked hard enough, if I reached the top of that mountain, the air would finally be clear. I thought that once I had the title, the watch, and the seat at the head of the table, I'd finally be able to breathe without the weight of someone else's judgment pressing down on my chest. But let me tell you something, brother. Racism doesn't care about your tax bracket. It doesn't care if you're wearing a $5,000 suit or a janitor's uniform. It's a shadow that follows you even when you're 30,000 feet in the air, tucked away in the velvet quiet of a first-class cabin. I was flying from New York to Los Angeles, a 6-hour haul. I'd been in board meetings since 6 in the morning, closing a deal that would put food on the tables of 500 employees. I was tired, not just need a nap, tired, but that deep, soul-weary exhaustion that comes from being the only black man in the room for 20 years. I just wanted to get to my seat, 2A, put on my noise-canceling headphones, and disappear into the clouds. Before I get into the heart of this, do me a favor. Tell me where you're watching this from. Drop it in the comments. I want to know where you are in the world, because I need to know if this feeling of being an outsider in your own success is something we all carry, or if it's just the air we breathe here in America. And if you've ever felt like your presence was a problem for someone else, hit that subscribe button. We need to stick together. I settled into 2A. The leather was soft. The cabin smelled like expensive espresso and that sterile, high-end perfume they use in luxury spaces. It's a world built for comfort, for people who don't have to explain why they're there. I watch the other passengers board. It's a habit of mine, a CEO's instinct. I scanned faces. I read energy. Most people were in their own worlds, rushing to stow their bags, complaining about the humidity or the gate delay. Then I saw her. I saw her. She was young, maybe mid-20s. She was black, and she was beautiful, in that way that feels like home, graceful. Even though she was clearly struggling, she was heavily pregnant, maybe 7 or 8 months along, carrying a heavy designer tote and looking like she'd just run a marathon through the terminal. She looked exhausted, her eyes scanning the seat numbers with a mix of desperation and hope. When she stopped at row 2, she checked her ticket one last time, let out a small, relieved sigh, and moved toward 2B. That's where things shifted. Occupying 2B was a man I'll call the suit. He was middle-aged, white, wearing a crisp blue Oxford shirt and a pair of expensive khakis. He had his laptop open on the tray table, his legs sprawled out into the footwell, as if the entire row belonged to him. He didn't even look up when she approached. He just kept typing, his fingers clicking aggressively, creating a wall of sound that said, "Do not disturb me." Maya, that was her name. I found out later. Stood there for a second. She was polite, too polite. Maybe that's the thing we do, right? We overcalibrate. We make ourselves smaller so they don't think we're aggressive. She cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me." "Sir," she said. Her voice was thin, tired. "I believe you're in my seat. I have 2B. The suit didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just reached over, grabbed his plastic cup of water, took a slow sip, and set it back down. Then, without looking at her, he muttered, "There must be a mistake. You're likely in the back. Check your paper again." "Sweetie." The word sweetie hit the air like a slap. It wasn't a term of endearment. It was a weapon. It was his way of saying she was a child, an intruder, someone who couldn't possibly understand how a ticket works. I felt a familiar heat start to rise at the back of my neck. I've heard that tone in boardrooms. I've heard it at country clubs. It's the tone of someone who thinks they own the room because of a birthright they never earned. Maya didn't back down, though. She held up her boarding pass. Her hand was shaking just a little bit, not from fear, I think, but from the sheer indignity of having to prove her existence. "No, sir, I've checked. This is my seat. Seat 2B. I'm quite far along, and I specifically booked this seat so I could have the extra legroom for the flight." The suit finally looked up. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her clothes. He looked at her braids. He looked at her pregnant belly. He sneered. It was a quick, sharp expression of disgust that he tried to mask as confusion. "Look," he said, closing his laptop just an inch. "I'm very busy. I have a major presentation in LA, and I need this space." There's no way they sat up. "Yate. Someone like you here. Go find the stewardess. I'm sure they have a nice spot for you in the back of the bus." My heart started thumping against my ribs. It was that slow, rhythmic drumbeat of a storm rolling in. I looked around the cabin. There were 4 other people in first class. A tech bro in 1A, an older couple in 3A and 3B. Everyone was looking away. They were looking at their phones, or out the window, or deep into their magazines. They were practicing the great American silence. They were watching a pregnant woman be humiliated and choosing to be invisible. I wanted to say something. Every fiber of my being wanted to stand up and roar. But I'm a black CEO in America. I know the rules. If I raise my voice, I'm the angry black man. I'm the security threat. The flight gets diverted. I end up on the news, and 500 people lose their jobs because the CEO lost his cool on a Delta flight. I had to be tactical. I had to be the ice, not the fire. Maya looked like she was about to cry, not because she was weak, but because being treated like you're invisible is a special kind of pain. It's a soul-crushing weight. She looked at the flight attendant station, hoping for a savior, and then she appeared. The flight attendant, let's call her Sarah. She had that practiced, plastic smile that never quite reaches the eyes. She walked over, her heels clicking on the floor, and she didn't look at the suit. She looked directly at Maya. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" Sarah asked. The ma'am was cold. It was the ma'am of a police officer at a traffic stop. Maya tried to explain. "He's in my seat. Miss, I have the ticket for 2B. I just want to sit down. I'm not feeling very well." Sarah didn't ask for the suit's ticket. She didn't ask him to move his laptop. She turned to Maya and said, "I'm going to need to see your ID and your boarding pass. Please step back into the galley so you aren't blocking the aisle for the other passengers." The suit smiled. It was a small, oily smirk. He opened his laptop back up and started typing again, as if the matter was settled. He'd won without even trying. He'd used the system as his personal bouncer. I watched Maya's face. The light in her eyes just went out. She looked at me for a split second, and in that look, I saw every grandmother, every sister, and every mother who had ever been told to step back. I felt a knot in my stomach tighten until it hurt. I looked at my hands, resting on the armrests of my leather seat. My knuckles were turning white. The skin stretched tight over the bone. The flight attendant reached out her hand, gesturing for Maya to move toward the back of the plane. "Come with me. Honey, let's see if we can find where you actually belong." I didn't move yet. I couldn't. I was caught in that terrible, suffocating space between who I am and how the world sees me. Watching that young woman stand there, clutching her stomach, while the cabin around us remained as silent as a tomb. I gripped the armrests so hard I thought the leather might tear. The tension in my fingers finally forced me to let go of the armrests, but the vibration of the plane seemed to migrate directly into my marrow. I watched through the narrow gap between the seats as the flight attendant, Sarah, led Maya toward the galley. It was a move designed to de-escalate, but we all knew what it really was. It was a removal. It was a way to hide the problem from the refined eyes of the other first-class passengers. so they could go back to their warm nuts and their sparkling water without the inconvenience of witnessing a human being's dignity being dismantled. I've spent my life navigating these systems, and I recognize the choreography. It's a dance of polite exclusion. You don't get yelled at. You get assisted right out of the room. You don't get called names. You get told there's a technical issue with your presence. I sat there, the air in my lungs feeling like lead, listening to the muffled murmur of their voices over the low hum of the jet engines. I could hear Sarah's voice. It had that high-pitched, helpful frequency that people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while doing something entirely unreasonable. I'm sure there's just a misunderstanding with the booking system. Honey, these third-party sites can be so tricky. Maya's response was a low, steady thrum of exhaustion. I booked this on the airline's app. Miss, 6 months ago. I have the confirmation email. I have the credit card statement. I felt the urge to stand up then, but my feet felt like they were made of stone. I was thinking about my board members. I was thinking about the merger I had to finalize on Monday. I was thinking about how many times I'd had to tell my own son to keep his hands visible, to speak softly, to never give them a reason to call him threatening. That's the tax we pay, isn't it? Even when you've got the CEO title, even when you're the one signing the checks, you still carry that ledger of how to survive a white space in the back of your head. It's a constant calculation, a mental weight that never truly goes away, not even at 30,000 feet. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the suit. He had settled into 2B as if he'd been born there. He had his noise-canceling headphones on now, but he hadn't plugged them into anything. He was just using them as a shield, a way to signal that he was finished with the conversation. He reached up and pressed the call button, not for help, but for service. When a second flight attendant leaned in, he didn't even look at her. He just pointed to his empty plastic cup, another water, and maybe some of those ginger cookies. He said, his voice flat and entitled. The audacity of it made the blood roar in my ears. He was sitting in a seat he didn't own, watching a pregnant woman be interrogated like a criminal in the galley, and his primary concern was a refill on his snacks. It was the casual nature of it that hurt the most. He wasn't some mustache-twirling villain. He was just a man who believed, deep in his soul, that his comfort was more important than her rights. He believed the world was a vending machine designed to serve him, and anyone else was just a glitch in the software. I looked back toward the galley. The curtain was partially drawn, but I could see Maya's silhouette. She was leaning against the cold metal of the beverage cart, one hand supporting the small of her back. She looked so small in that moment, despite the life she was carrying inside her, and that's when I heard it. The solution? Tell you what, Sarah said, her voice dripping with that artificial sweetness that makes your teeth ache. We have a lovely seat in premium economy, row 12. It's right behind the bulkhead, so you'll have plenty of room for your legs. And I'll even make sure you get a complimentary snack box. It's much more private. You'll be much more comfortable there than trying to squeeze in up here while we're fully booked. It was a downgrade disguised as a favor. It was the separate but equal of the sky. They were asking her to pay the full price of a first-class ticket for the privilege of sitting in the back, just so they didn't have to disturb the man who had stolen her spot. They were asking her to be the bigger person because it was easier to move a black woman than it was to challenge a white man's ego. I felt a surge of self-loathing. Why was I still sitting here? I'm Marcus. I run a company that moves millions of tons of freight across the globe every year. I negotiate with unions. I stare down competitors. But here, in this pressurized cabin, I was a ghost. I was a man who had traded his voice for a comfortable chair. I looked at the screen on my own seat back. It was showing the flight path. We were over the Midwest. a tiny plane icon crawling across a map of states that didn't always want me there. I thought about the storytime videos I see online, the ones where people talk about their main character energy. In my life, I'm always the main character. But in this cabin, in this moment, I was just an extra in a movie about someone else's prejudice, and I hated it. I hated the smell of the leather. I hated the quiet. I hated the way my heart was hammering against my ribs like a bird in a cage. The second flight attendant came back with the suit's water. She set it down on the tray table, her tray table, with a little napkin. He didn't even say thank you. He just took a sip and went back to his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. I caught a glimpse of his screen. He was working on a spreadsheet, numbers, formulas, logic. The irony was almost too much to bear. He was a man of logic who was currently ignoring the most basic logic of human decency. I looked over at the couple in 3A and 3B. They were an older white couple, well-dressed, looking like they were off to a grandchild's graduation. They were staring straight ahead, their faces frozen in that "not my business" mask. I wanted to shake them. I wanted to ask them if they saw what I saw, but I knew the answer. They didn't see a tragedy. They saw a minor boarding delay. They saw a woman being difficult about a seat. That's the thing about systemic failure. It doesn't require everyone to be evil. It just requires enough people to be quiet. It requires the Sarahs of the world to follow the path of least resistance. It requires the people in row 3 to keep their eyes on their magazines. And it requires men like me to stay in our assigned seats, grateful that we weren't the ones being moved this time. But the silence in that cabin was starting to feel like a physical weight. It was pressing down on me, making it hard to draw a full breath. I looked at the galley curtain again. Maya had stopped talking. She was just standing there, her head bowed, looking at the boarding pass in her hand, as if she were trying to memorize the ink. She looked defeated, not angry, just tired, that deep, generational tiredness that you can't sleep off. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of my mother. She used to work as a nurse, double shifts, coming home with her feet swollen and her spirit frayed. I remembered her telling me once, "Marcus, they're going to try to tell you where you belong. They'll do it with a smile, and they'll do it with a rule book. Your job is to remember that you're the one who writes the book." I hadn't thought about those words in years. I'd been too busy writing business plans and quarterly reports. I'd been too busy fitting in to remember how to stand out. I looked at the suit again. He looked so comfortable, so safe. He knew that the system was his bodyguard. He knew that if he just stayed in that seat long enough, the world would eventually bend to his will. He was counting on the great American silence to protect him. He was counting on me to keep his head down. I felt a coldness wash over me then. It wasn't the air conditioning. It was a sudden, crystalline clarity. I realized that if I stayed in this seat, I was just as guilty as the man in 2B. My success meant nothing if I couldn't use it to shield someone else from the wind. My title was just a collection of letters if I didn't have the courage to speak them out loud. The flight attendant, Sarah, stepped back into the cabin. She looked toward the suit, gave him a small, reassuring nod, and then turned to the galley to finish the removal. She was about to lead Maya away. She was about to finalize the lie. I felt my hand move before my brain could stop it. I reached up and unbuckled my seatbelt. The click sounded like a gunshot in the silent cabin. Every head in the first 3 rows turned toward me. I felt the heat of their stares, the confusion, the sudden shift in the energy of the room. I wasn't an invisible passenger anymore. I was a man standing up. I didn't say a word yet. I just stood there in the aisle, my height filling the space, my shadow falling over the suit's laptop. I felt the floor of the plane vibrating under my shoes, and for the first time since I boarded, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I turned my head slowly, looking past Sarah, directly into the galley where Maya was standing with her bag clutched to her chest. I caught her eye, and I didn't smile. I didn't have to. I just looked at her with everything I was, waiting for the words to form in the back of my throat. The suit stopped typing. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed, his mouth slightly open as if he were about to ask me what I was doing. I could feel the silence of the cabin stretching, thinning, becoming so fragile that a single breath could shatter it. I didn't look at him. I kept my gaze fixed on Maya, my hand reaching out to steady myself against the headrest of my own seat, as the air around us seemed to hum with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. The static electricity in the cabin seemed to snap as I stood there, my shadow draped over the man in 2B like a shroud. Sarah, the flight attendant, froze with her hands still hovering near the galley curtain, her professional mask finally cracking just enough to show the panic underneath. She looked at me, then at my suit, then at the heavy gold watch on my wrist, calculating my net worth in real time, trying to decide if my interruption was going to be a problem she could handle or a disaster that would cost her a job. But before I could even draw the breath to speak, before I could let out the 20 years of boardroom authority I had stored in my chest, a voice came from the seat directly across the aisle from me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was the high, clear pitch of a child who hasn't yet learned how to lie to keep the peace. "Mommy, why is that man sitting in the ladies' chair?" I turned my head slightly. A little girl, maybe 9 years old, was sitting in 1B. Her name, I'd heard her mother whisper earlier, was Chloe. She had her chin resting on the edge of her seat back, her eyes wide and honest, fixed directly on the suit. Her mother, a woman who looked like she spent her life trying to be invisible, tried to pull her back, whispering for her to be quiet. But Chloe wasn't having it. She didn't have the proper filters. She hadn't been trained in the art of the great American silence. She just saw wrong, and her world was still small enough that wrong things were supposed to be fixed. "He's being a bully, Mommy," Chloe said, her voice rising just enough to carry through the entire cabin. "He told her to go to the back of the bus. Why is he allowed to be mean just because he has a computer?" The suit didn't look at Chloe. He looked at me, his eyes darting towards Sarah for support. He was looking for someone to validate his reality, but the silence of the cabin had turned against him. The older couple in row 3 had finally put down their magazines. The tech bro in 1A had taken off his headphones. The child had broken the spell. She had stripped away the logistics and the booking errors and called it exactly what it was, a bully taking a chair. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. The angry black man trap was still there, waiting for me to trip it, but I realized I didn't need to be angry. I just needed to be the person I had spent 30 years becoming. I leaned down, not into the suit's personal space, but close enough that he could see the lack of fear in my eyes. "The child is asking you a question," I said. My voice was low, the kind of low I use when I'm about to fire a senior VP who thinks he's indispensable. It's a voice that doesn't need to shout, because it knows it carries the weight of the mountain. And frankly, I'm interested in the answer too. The suit tried to scoff, but it came out as a weak, wet sound. "This isn't your business. This is a private matter between me and the airline. I have work to do. I make it my business when I have to watch a pregnant woman stand in a galley while a man hides behind a laptop screen," I said. I looked at Sarah, who was hovering like a ghost. "Miss, I'd like to see the manifest now, because I happen to know how these systems work. I own a logistics firm that handles more data in an hour than this airline does in a week. I know that seat 2B belongs to the person whose name is on the digital ticket, not the person who got there first and refused to move. Sarah stammered, her face turning a blotchy red. Sir, we're just trying to find a comfortable solution for everyone. The solution is for that man to get out of that seat. I interrupted. I didn't raise my voice, but I felt the power of the room shifting toward me. He is an unauthorized occupant of a paid fare. If he isn't moved in the next 60 seconds, I'm going to call my personal attorney the moment we land, and I'm going to make sure that the video of this child calling out a bully is the first thing your corporate board sees on Monday morning. The suit's eyes went wide. He looked at my face, really looked at me for the first time. He saw the confidence. He saw the lack of hesitation. And then he saw the logo on the leather folder I had sitting on my own tray table. It was the logo of my company, a stylized U on a black background. I saw the moment the gears turned in his head. I saw the moment he realized he wasn't just sitting next to someone like you. He was sitting next to the man who signed the contracts for the very supply chain software his company provided. I recognized him then, too. Not his name, but his face. He was a mid-level director at one of our vendors. He'd probably been at my keynote speech 3 months ago, sitting in the back, clapping while he waited for his chance to pitch me. Mr. Sterling, he whispered. The sweetie in the back of the bus arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a pathetic, shivering desperation. The name is Marcus, I said, my voice like a serrated blade. But for you, it's the client. And right now, the client is disgusted. The silence that followed was absolute. Maya was still standing in the galley, her hand over her mouth, tears finally spilling over. Chloe was watching us like it was a movie, her little hand still gripping her mother's arm. The suit started to scramble. He didn't just close his laptop. He practically slammed it shut. He began stuffing his cords into his bag with trembling hands, his face the color of spoiled milk. I didn't realize. I thought there was a mistake. I'll move right now, he stammered, not even looking at Maya. As he shoved past her toward the back of the plane, he didn't wait for Sarah to guide him. He fled. He ran toward the back of the bus he had so casually suggested for her, his tail between his legs. I turned to Maya. The fire in my chest was still burning, but I softened my gaze. I stepped aside, clearing the path to the seat that belonged to her. Ma'am, I said, gesturing to 2B. Please, sit down. You've been on your feet far too long. She walked forward, her steps slow and cautious, as if she were afraid the floor might give way. As she passed me, she reached out and touched my forearm. It was a light touch, but it felt like a bolt of lightning. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with a million emotions I didn't have words for yet. Thank you for seeing me. I watched her settle into the leather, watched her finally let out the breath she'd been holding since she boarded. I looked over at Chloe, the little girl who had started the landslide. She was smiling, a bright, triumphant grin that made the whole cabin feel a little less cold. I gave her a small nod. A soldier recognizing another soldier, Sarah was still standing there, looking like she wanted to disappear into the carpet. She tried to offer me a complimentary drink, a token of appreciation for my patience. I didn't even look at her. I just sat back down in 2A, the leather creaking under my weight, feeling the hum of the engine beneath my feet. As we leveled out at 30,000 feet, I stared out the window at the vast, empty sky, watching the clouds churn and roll, my mind already spinning with the weight of what had just happened, and the long journey still ahead of us. The silence that filled the cabin after the man in 2B fled was different from the heavy, suffocating quiet of a few minutes ago. This was a clean silence, the kind that follows a summer thunderstorm when the air is suddenly sharp and the dust has been washed away. I sat there for a long time, just watching the sunlight dance across the mahogany grain of my tray table, feeling the steady, rhythmic pulse of the Boeing 777 as it carved its way through the stratosphere. My heart had slowed its frantic drumming, replaced by a deep, resonant stillness that felt like an anchor. I looked over at Maya. She was leaning back in the seat that should have been hers from the start, her eyes closed, her hands resting protectively over the curve of her stomach. The lines of tension around her mouth had finally softened. She looked like she was finally breathing, really breathing. For the first time since she stepped onto the jet bridge. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How we can be surrounded by luxury. The finest leather, the most expensive champagne, the quietest cabins, and yet still feel like we're drowning because we're being denied the basic oxygen of respect. Sarah, the flight attendant, came by a few minutes later. Her movements were stiff, her professional mask glued back on with a little too much effort. She moved to offer Maya a warm towel and a bottle of high-end mineral water, her voice a whisper of manufactured kindness. Maya thanked her, but she didn't open her eyes. She didn't need the water as much as she had needed the justice. I checked my watch. We still had 4 hours of flight time left. 4 hours in this suspended world between where we were and where we were going. I opened my laptop, but I didn't go back to my emails. I didn't look at the quarterly projections or the merger documents. Instead, I stared at a blank document, my fingers hovering over the keys. I thought about the man who had just run to the back of the plane. I thought about the fear I saw in his eyes when he realized my name carried more weight than his prejudice. It was a hollow victory, in a way. He didn't change because he realized he was wrong. He changed because he realized I was powerful. And that's the bitter pill of success for a man like me. Knowing that sometimes the only thing that protects your humanity is your bank account. I looked across the aisle at Chloe. She was coloring in a book, her small face scrunched in concentration. Her mother was watching her, a look of profound relief and maybe a little bit of awe on her face. I realized then that the most powerful person on this entire flight wasn't me, and it certainly wasn't the captain or the man in the expensive suit who'd been chased away. It was that 9-year-old girl. She didn't have a title. She didn't have a company. She just had the truth, and she wasn't afraid to let it fly. I felt a sudden, sharp need to record this, not for a legal case, but for myself, for the legacy I'm trying to build. We talk so much about making it, about reaching that first-class life, but we rarely talk about what happens when we get there and find out the ghosts of the past are waiting for us in the extra legroom seats. I started typing, not a business plan, but a letter to my own son. I wanted him to know that the suit I wear isn't a shield. It's a responsibility. I wanted him to understand that if he ever finds himself in a position of power, his first job isn't to protect his own comfort, but to be the voice for the person standing in the galley, holding a ticket the world refuses to honor. About 2 hours before we began our descent into Los Angeles, Maya stirred. She sat up slowly and looked over at me. For the first time, she gave me a real smile, not a polite one, but one that reached her eyes. "I never got to properly thank you," she said. Her voice was stronger now, grounded. "I'm Maya. I'm a pediatric nurse. I was heading home to see my mom before I can't fly anymore." "I'm Marcus," I replied, keeping my voice low. "And you don't owe me a thank you. You paid for this seat. You earned your place here. I'm just sorry it took a 9-year-old girl and a CEO's ego to get people to act like humans." She laughed, a soft, musical sound that seemed to brighten the dimming cabin. "Sometimes that's what it takes, I guess. I've spent my whole life being told to wait my turn, to be patient, to not make a scene. But watching you stand up, It reminded me that I don't have to ask for permission to exist. We talked for a while, not about race or the man in 2B, but about life, about the baby she was expecting, about the garden she was planting in her backyard, about the simple, beautiful things that make the struggle worth it. It was a reminder to me that behind every drama or incident we see on the news, there are real people with real lives, just trying to get home to their families. As the pilot announced our initial descent, I saw the man from 2B walk past us toward the restroom. He kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the floorboards, scurrying like a shadow. He didn't look at Maya. He didn't look at me. He looked like a man who had realized that his world was much smaller than he'd previously thought. I didn't feel anger toward him anymore. I felt a strange kind of pity. Imagine living a life where you're so small that the only way you can feel big is by trying to diminish a pregnant woman. What a lonely, hollow way to exist. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, the one I use for my most important ideas. I tore out a page and wrote a quick note. Then, as we were taxiing toward the gate at LAX, I leaned over and handed it to Chloe's mother. "For her college fund," I whispered. "Tell her it's a truth-teller scholarship from a friend." The look on the mother's face as she saw the business card and the promise written on the back was something I'll never forget. It wasn't about the money. I have plenty of that. It was about acknowledging that her daughter had done something that most adults are too paralyzed to do. She had been brave when it was easier to be quiet. When the cabin doors finally opened and the air of California rushed in, I didn't hurry to get off. I waited. I watched Maya gather her things, helped her with her bag, and made sure she was settled with a gate agent for a wheelchair escort. I watched Chloe skip down the jet bridge, her ponytail bouncing, unaware that she had just changed the trajectory of a grown man's soul. I walked through the terminal, the familiar sounds of the airport swirling around me, the announcements, the rolling suitcases, the frantic energy of thousands of people going nowhere and everywhere at once. I felt lighter than I had in years. I realized that first class isn't a section on a plane. It's a state of being. It's the decision to walk through the world with your eyes open and your heart ready to fight for what's right. Even when you're tired, even when it's inconvenient. I'm sitting in the back of a car now, watching the lights of Los Angeles blur past the window. I'm thinking about you, the person reading or listening to this. I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with yourself. When the silence gets heavy, when you see someone being pushed to the back, which version of yourself shows up? Are you the one hiding behind the laptop? Are you the one looking at the magazine? Or are you the one who unbuckles the seatbelt? Let me know in the comments. Tell me about a time you found your voice, or a time you wish you had. We're all in this together, flying through this life, and the only way we're going to make it is if we start looking at the person in the seat next to us as a human being first. If this story meant something to you, if it sparked a little bit of that fire in your chest, please subscribe and share it. We need more truth tellers. We need more Chloes. And we definitely need more people who realize that dignity is the only thing we can truly take with us when we land. I'm going to go see my family now. I'm going to hug my son a little tighter. And I'm going to keep writing, keep speaking, and keep making sure that the unseen are finally, truly seen. Stay brave, everyone. I'll see you in the next one. I leaned back against the cool leather of the car seat, watching my reflection in the dark window as the city lights flickered across my face, wondering how many other stories were waiting to be told in the quiet corners of the sky. I didn't sleep much that first night in Los Angeles. Every time I closed my eyes, I wasn't seeing the skyline of the city or the palm trees swaying in the breeze outside my hotel window. I was back in that pressurized cabin. I kept hearing the click of my seatbelt and the high, Thin voice of Chloe asking why a grown man was being a bully. It's funny how a 6-hour flight can feel longer than a 30-year career. I paced the floor of my suite, the moonlight hitting the glass of water on my nightstand, thinking about the man from 2B. I knew his face now. I knew exactly who he was. In my world, information is the currency, and I'm a very wealthy man. He worked for a firm called Meridian Systems. They provide the backbone for our logistics tracking. We pay them 8 figures a year to keep our gears turning. And there he was, a director-level executive, treating a pregnant woman like a glitch in his spreadsheet. I realized that firing him wasn't enough. If he felt that comfortable being a monster at 30,000 feet, it was because the culture he worked in provided him with the oxygen to breathe. The next morning, I didn't head to my scheduled merger meeting. I called my assistant and told her to clear my morning. I had a different kind of merger to attend to. The merging of my private convictions with my professional power. I walked into the headquarters of Meridian Systems at 9:00 a.m. I wasn't wearing my usual friendly CEO smile. I was wearing the face of the man who stood up in the aisle. The lobby was all glass and chrome, designed to look transparent and modern. But I knew better. Transparency in business is often just a window you can't see through. The receptionist's eyes widened when she saw me. She recognized me from the industry journals, or maybe she just sensed the storm I was carrying in my chest. Within 5 minutes, I was ushered into the top-floor office of their CEO, a man named Robert who I'd played golf with twice and never truly trusted. Robert stood up, hand extended, a wide, practiced grin on his face. "Marcus, what a surprise. I thought we weren't meeting until the gala on Thursday. To what do I owe the pleasure of a surprise visit from the king of logistics?" I didn't take his hand. I didn't sit in the chair he offered. I stood by the window, looking out at the sprawl of LA, and I told him the story. I told him about the pregnant nurse. I told him about the back of the bus comment. I told him about the 9-year-old girl who had more integrity in her pinky finger than his director had in his entire body. Robert's face went through a fascinating series of changes. First, there was confusion. Then, there was a flash of annoyance that I was wasting his time with travel gripes. But when I mentioned the man's name, the man from 2B, and the fact that he was currently hiding in their LA branch, Robert's skin went ashen. He knew what was coming. He knew that I didn't just want an apology. "Marcus, look," Robert started, his voice shifting into damage control mode. "He's a top performer. He's been under a lot of stress with the LA launch. People say things they don't mean when they're tired. I'll have a talk with him. We'll put him on a sensitivity course. I'll even have him send a personal gift to the woman." "You're not listening." "Robert," I interrupted. My voice was that low, vibrating frequency that makes the air in a room feel heavy. "I don't want a gift card for Maya. I don't want a sensitivity course that he'll sleep through. I want to know why a man like that feels safe in your company. I want to know why he thought he could use your corporate name as a shield to humiliate a human being." I pulled a single sheet of paper from my pocket. It was a formal notice of intent to terminate our contract with Meridian Systems. "This is 10% of your annual revenue. Robert, I'm moving my business to your competitor. Not because their tech is better. It's not. But because their CEO doesn't hire bullies. And I'm going to make sure every other black executive in my network knows exactly why." The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the server racks in the next room. Robert looked at the paper like it was a live grenade. He tried to argue, tried to bargain, but I was already walking toward the door. "One more thing," I said, stopping with my hand on the handle. "I'm creating a scholarship for the girl on that flight. It's called the Chloe Truth Teller Fund. I expect Meridian Systems to match my initial $1 million endowment. If you do that, I might delay the contract termination for 90 days to see if you can actually change the culture of this place. If not, I'll see you at the gala, and I'll be the one telling this story to the press." I walked out of that building and took a deep breath of the smoggy LA air. It tasted like victory, but a quiet, heavy kind of victory. I called my son on the way back to the hotel. We talked for an hour. I didn't tell him how to be a CEO. I told him about a little girl named Chloe and a nurse named Maya. I told him that the most important thing he could ever own wasn't a company, but the courage to stand up when everyone else is sitting down. I realized then that my Unseen Black project wasn't just a YouTube channel. It was a mission. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just building a legacy of money. I was building a legacy of light. 6 months passed like a blurred landscape seen from a fast-moving train. The Unseen Black channel had grown into something I never expected. A community of millions. A place where people shared their own stories of the pressurized cabins in their lives. But despite the success and the speeches, my mind kept drifting back to that afternoon over the Midwest. I found myself checking my email every morning, looking for one specific name. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in October, it finally arrived. An email from Maya. The subject line was simple. "He's here." I opened it to find a photo of a tiny, perfect baby boy wrapped in a blue blanket. He had a head full of dark curls and eyes that looked like they were already searching for the truth. His name was Elias. Maya wrote that she was doing well, that the birth had been smooth, and that she still thought about that flight every single day. She invited me to a small gathering at her home in New Jersey. A thank you dinner, she called it. I didn't hesitate. I told my assistant to book the flight. This time, I didn't care if I was in first class or the very last row. I just needed to be there. Maya's house was a small, bright bungalow on a quiet street lined with oak trees. It was the kind of place that felt like a sanctuary. When she opened the door, she looked different. Stronger, more settled. She was holding Elias. And when she saw me, she didn't shake my hand. She hugged me. It was a hug that carried the weight of everything we'd shared at 30,000 feet. "He's beautiful, Maya," I whispered, looking down at the sleeping infant. "He's a fighter," she said, leading me into the living room, just like the people who stood up for him before he was even born. As I sat on her sofa, I noticed a framed photo on the mantel. It wasn't of her family. It was a Polaroid I hadn't seen before. A photo of Maya and Chloe on the jet bridge after we landed in LA. They were both smiling, their arms around each other. It was a picture of 2 generations of Black excellence, bonded by a moment of shared defiance. The thank you dinner wasn't just for me. To my absolute shock, Chloe and her mother were there too. Chloe had grown a few inches, her hair in elaborate braids, her eyes still sparkling with that same fierce honesty. When she saw me, she ran over and gave me a high five. "Mr. Marcus, did you see the news?" she asked, her voice brimming with excitement. I knew what she meant. The Chloe Truth Teller Scholarship had officially launched its first round of grants. We had received over 10,000 applications from young people who had stood up against injustice in their schools and communities. The first recipient was a young man who had organized a protest against unfair disciplinary actions in his high school. I saw it. "Chloe," I said, crouching down to her level, "and I want you to know that none of it would have happened if you hadn't asked that question on the plane. You started a landslide. Kiddo." We spent the evening talking, laughing, and sharing stories. We didn't talk about the suit or the flight attendant who tried to move Maya. We talked about hope. We talked about the future we wanted for Elias. I realized that this was the real first class. This circle of people, this chosen family, gathered in a warm kitchen, bound by a shared belief that no one is invisible. Maya told me that she had used some of the settlement money I had helped her negotiate with the airline to start a community health clinic for expectant mothers in her neighborhood. She was turning her pain into a platform. She was making sure that other women wouldn't have to face the world alone, whether they were on a plane or in a hospital waiting room. "You changed my life, Marcus," Maya said as we cleared the plates. "Not just because you got me that seat, but because you showed me that I was worth fighting for. I'd spent so long trying to be the perfect patient, the perfect nurse, the perfect black woman. I forgot that I'm allowed to just be a person." I looked at the unseen black logo on my phone, the simple white U on the black background. It had become a symbol for so many people. But standing there in Maya's kitchen, I realized that the U didn't just stand for unseen. It stood for united. It stood for the us that happens when we stop being afraid of each other's shadows. Before I left, I handed Chloe a small gift. It was a gold compass, engraved with the words, "True north is always truth. Keep finding it, Chloe." I told her, "The world is gonna try to tell you to look at your feet. Keep looking at the stars. And if anyone tries to tell you to move, you tell them you're exactly where you belong." I walked out to the car Maya had called for me, the cool Jersey air smelling of damp earth and late autumn leaves. I looked back at the house, the warm yellow light spilling out from the windows. I saw the silhouettes of Maya, Chloe, and the baby through the glass. They were a living, breathing testament to the fact that one moment of courage can ripple out forever. I thought about the man from 2B again. I wondered where he was. I hoped he was learning, but more importantly, I hoped he was realizing that the world didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the people who were brave enough to care about someone other than themselves. I'm back in my office in New York now. The skyline is beautiful tonight. A million lights flickering like diamonds on a velvet cloth. But my favorite light isn't out there. It's the one I see when I look at the photos from Maya's house. I'm a CEO. Yes. I'm a successful man. Yes. But more than that, I'm a witness. I'm a storyteller. And as long as I have a voice, I'm going to make sure that no one, not a nurse, not a child, not a janitor, ever feels like they have to apologize for taking up space in this world. To everyone out there watching this, I have one final thing to say. We spend so much time worrying about our status. We worry about our seats, our titles, and our bank accounts. But at the end of the day, when the flight lands and the cabin doors open, none of that matters. What matters is who you helped stand up. What matters is whose hand you held when the air got thin. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. Thank you for making Unseen Black more than just a name. You are the reason I keep telling these stories. You are the reason I keep standing up. If you've been inspired to find your own true north, let me know in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going, because the flight isn't over yet, and there are still so many seats that need to be claimed. I closed my notebook and looked out at the city, the unseen black logo reflecting in the glass of my office door, a silent promise to the world that the silence was finally over. Stay brave, stay visible, and I'll see you in the next story.